Hello guys, and greetings from my YouTube channel presenting another educational video on cardiac axis deviations. Now a cardiac axis is defined as the average direction of depolarization waves through the ventricles. But before we go into the cardiac axis deviations, let's first review some general concepts. The first thing is that when the electricity, which is the depolarization waves of course, when the electricity moves towards a lead, we get a positive deflection of QRS complex on an ECG, so it moves upwards. When the electricity moves away from a lead, then we get a negative deflection of QRS complex. We look at the limb leads to determine the cardiac axis, not the precordial chest leads. And the limb leads are basically categorized into two categories. The first is the bipolar limb leads, which are leads 1, 2, and 3. And the second is the augmented unipolar limb leads, which are AVR, AVL, and AVF. And pretty much actually all you need to look at is leads 1, 2, and AVF to determine the cardiac axis. But we're gonna see different methods to determine the cardiac axis shortly. And here again we can see a good representation of the 6 limb leads. Now please note that these are called the limb leads, not the limb electrodes. The limb electrodes are actually the electrodes which are placed on your limbs, and the limb leads are calculated in a certain way from the limb electrodes, giving an average spatial electrical direction of each lead. So for example, we have lead 1, which is directed horizontally to the left at 0 degrees. We have lead 2, which is directed downwards and a little bit to the left at positive 60 degrees. We have lead AVF, which is directed downwards at exactly positive 90 degrees, and etc. for all the leads. And here on this drawing, we can see a representation of a normal cardiac axis. And you can see that a normal cardiac axis is actually tilted to the left. And that's because of the thicker left ventricle and the thicker left bundle branch. And according to the illustration here, which is commonly known as the Cabrera system, which shows the average direction of the limb leads, we can see that from this drawing, the cardiac axis in this drawing is about positive 45 degrees, somewhere in here. And this is normal. But a normal cardiac axis actually has a range. And the normal range for a normal cardiac axis is anywhere between minus 30 degrees to positive 90 degrees. And anywhere outside that is an abnormal cardiac axis, as we will be seeing shortly. Here on this drawing, we can see an inferior wall myocardial infarction with a left axis deviation. And the left axis deviation in an inferior wall myocardial infarction is usually due to a concomitant left anterior hemiblock. But an inferior wall myocardial infarction can cause it itself without the hemiblock. And on the illustration here, a left axis deviation is anywhere between minus 30 degrees to minus 90 degrees. So this cardiac axis actually should be tilted a little bit upwards so it fits between minus 30 and minus 90 degrees. On this drawing here, we can see a right axis deviation. And the right axis deviation is anywhere between positive 90 degrees to a positive 180 degrees. So you can see here it's about 135 degrees. So here again, to summarize, we have the normal cardiac axis anywhere between minus 30 degrees and positive 90 degrees. The left axis deviation is anywhere between minus 30 degrees to minus 90 degrees. A right axis deviation is anywhere between positive 90 degrees to positive 180 degrees. And finally, the extreme axis deviation, which is anywhere between a minus 90 degrees to a positive 180. So, right here. So, now finally, let's move to the ECG. How does the cardiac axis look on the ECG? So, again, the normal cardiac axis, we said, is going to direct towards anywhere between minus 30 and positive 90. So, do you expect lead 1 to be positive or negative? And the answer is positive, because the cardiac axis is moving towards lead 1. Do you expect lead 2 to be positive or negative? And the answer is, again, positive, because the cardiac axis is moving towards lead 2. How about AVF? And the answer again is positive. But actually AVF could be negative just between 0 and minus 30 in this little bit here. And that because between 0 and minus 30 degrees, the cardiac axis would be more than 90 degrees away from the AVF. So as a general rule, if the cardiac axis is more than 90 degrees away from that specific lead, then it would be negative. So let's say AVF. So if the cardiac axis anywhere between above 0 or above 180 right here, then that lead would be negative. On the other hand, if your cardiac axis is within 90 degrees of a specific lead, so let's for example pick up AVF. If the cardiac axis is between 90 degrees in any direction, then we would consider it as positive, and we would consider the cardiac axis to be moving towards that lead. So again, if the cardiac axis is more than 90 degrees away from the lead in any direction, then we would consider the cardiac axis to be moving away from that lead. If it's between 90 degrees of a specific lead, as for example between 0 and 90 and 90 and 180 of AVF, then we would consider the cardiac axis to be moving towards that specific lead, and that lead would be positive. The last condition is, what if the cardiac axis is exactly perpendicular at 90 degrees of a specific lead? Then that lead would look isoelectric on the ECG. The positive concordance and the negative concordance of the QRS would be equal, so isoelectric. So let's pick up our first example on a normal cardiac axis. So again, all you need to look at is actually just leads 1, 2, and AVF. So you can see here that 1 has a positive deflection, lead 2 has a positive deflection, and lead AVF has a positive deflection. Therefore, this is a normal cardiac axis. And you can expect that the cardiac axis is kind of moving downwards to the left, so towards the left lower quadrant. And you could confirm it here again on this illustration. You can see that if it's moving just like this to the left and downwards, your 1, 2, and AVF will be positive. And if you would like, just to confirm, you can see that AVR is negative, so it's moving away from AVR like this, downwards and to the left. You can see that 3 is positive, so again it's moving kind of within 90 degrees of lead 3, so right here. And you can see that AVL is isoelectric, so this puts the axis actually perpendicular to AVL, so exactly at positive 60 degrees. But I'm sorry for the too much confusion. Again, all you need to look at is just leads 1, 2, and AVF to determine the cardiac axis. Is it normal or not? Here we can see an example on left axis deviation. We can see that lead 1 is positive, lead 2 is negative, and AVF is negative. So the axis is moving towards lead 1 and away from leads 2 and AVF. We can see on this illustration that the cardiac axis would be moving towards lead 1, so about right here. But since 2 and AVF are negative, so it's gonna be somewhere here. So it's within 90 degrees of lead 1, within 90 degrees, but it's away from 2 and AVF, more than 90 degrees away. So it's gonna be somewhere in this between minus 30 degrees and minus 90 degrees. Now please note, for a left axis deviation to happen, you have to have lead 1 positive and both leads 2 and AVF negative. Because just imagine with me for a second, if leads 1 and 2 were positive, but only AVF was negative, that means the cardiac axis will be somewhere between 0 and minus 30 degrees, because it would be moving towards both leads 1 and 2, so somewhere in here, and at the same time it's moving away from AVF. It's more than 90 degrees away, remember. So the cardiac axis actually would be normal. You have to have both leads 2 and AVF negative and lead 1 positive for a left axis deviation to happen. Here on this ECG, we can see an example of a right axis deviation. First, we can see that lead 1 is negative and lead AVF is positive. So on this illustration, we can see that lead 1 is negative, so that means it has the cardiac axis must be anywhere between minus 90 to positive 90, because lead 1 is negative, so it's more than 90 degrees away in each direction. And the second thing is that since AVF is positive, that means the cardiac axis must be in this quadrant, the right lower quadrant, because it's moving towards AVF within 90 degrees. Now please note that lead 2 doesn't really matter in right axis deviation, and that's because the range of a right axis deviation is pretty wide, and therefore a positive lead 2 could fall in the right axis deviation quadrant, the right lower quadrant, and even a negative lead 2 could fall within the right axis deviation quadrant. So that's why lead 2 doesn't really matter in right axis deviation. So again, all you need to have is a negative lead 1 and a positive AVF, and that equals right axis deviation. And now coming to our last example, the extreme axis deviation. And making long story short, all you need to have is a negative lead 1 and a negative AVF. And to confirm on this illustration, if you have a negative lead 1, that means it's anywhere between this minus 90 degrees to positive 90 degrees, because it's more than 90 degrees away in each direction. And the second thing is that since AVF is negative, that means it's also away from AVF more than 90 degrees in each direction. And to combine both, that means your cardiac axis must be in this quadrant, away from both leads 1 and AVF. So this is called extreme axis deviation. And to confirm, you can also see that AVR is positive, so it's towards AVR, and you can see that also 2 and 3 are negative, so it's also away from 2 and 3. This is extreme axis deviation. Now please note, in all of the previous examples, we have been using the quadrant method to determine the cardiac axis deviation. But what if we want to know how much exactly is the cardiac axis deviation? What is the degree of the cardiac axis? Because the quadrant method cannot really tell you how much is your cardiac axis deviation. It could only tell you what is your cardiac axis. Is it a normal one, or is it a left axis deviation? Is it a right axis deviation, or is it an extreme axis deviation? But what if we wanted to know how much is your cardiac axis? Then we would be using the second method, the isoelectric lead method. And it's pretty simple. The first thing is that you need to find the isoelectric lead on the ECG. And the second thing is that find the positive leads, and the cardiac axis will be towards the positive leads. For example, let's say the isoelectric lead was AVL on the ECG. So your cardiac axis must be perpendicular to the AVL. It has to be at 90 degrees. So the cardiac axis will be either pointing to positive 60 degrees or to minus 120 degrees. And you can determine which side is the correct one by looking at the other leads. So, for example, if leads 1 to an AVF were positive, and AVL is isoelectric, of course, then your cardiac axis must be pointing to the positive 60 degrees and not to the minus 120 degrees. Whereas if AVL was the isoelectric lead, leads 1 to an AVF were negative, and the lead AVR was the positive one, then your cardiac axis must be pointing at exactly minus 120 degrees in this direction. So let's apply what we have just said. If you can remember, this is the first ECG that we have explained using the quadrant method. And if you remember, we have said that since leads 1 to an AVF are positive, then this is a normal cardiac axis. But using the quadrant method, we cannot really tell again how much is your cardiac axis, because a normal cardiac axis could be anywhere between minus 30 degrees to positive 90 degrees. So using the quadrant method alone cannot tell us how much is your cardiac axis. So, how about using the isoelectric lead method? So, first we look for the isoelectric lead, which is the AVL. It's isoelectric. The positive deflection equals the negative deflection, which means the cardiac axis is exactly at 90 degrees angle to this lead. So, using the Cabrera system, we can draw the cardiac axis being exactly perpendicular to the AVL. But again, the cardiac axis could be either pointing to the one direction, which is the minus 120 degrees, or to the other direction, which is positive 60 degrees. And to know to which direction it is pointing, we have to look at some of the other leads. So, for example, you can see here that leads 1, 2, 3, and AVF are all positive. So that means your cardiac axis must be pointing towards those leads 1, 2, AVF, and 3. And so your cardiac axis must be pointing to the positive 60 degrees and not to the minus 120 degrees. And you can confirm that also by seeing that AVR is negative, so it's pointing away from AVR. So again, the biggest advantage about using this isoelectric lead method is that you kind of have a reference number, which is that the cardiac axis is at 90 degrees angle to the isoelectric lead. And now we have an example of a left axis deviation. So again, first using the quadrant method, we can see that lead 1 is positive and AVF is negative, and lead 2 is kind of isoelectric. And again, we said that the quadrant method, we need to have both leads 2 and AVF negative. So using the quadrant method, we can say this is kind of borderline left axis deviation. But using the isoelectric lead method, our isoelectric lead is of course lead 2, and using the Cabrera system, we can go to lead 2 and then draw a perpendicular line to lead 2. So the cardiac axis is either pointing to the minus 30 degrees or to the positive 150 degrees. And since leads 1 and AVL are positive, then your cardiac axis is pointing to leads 1 and AVL. So your cardiac axis must be minus 30 degrees, which is actually a borderline left axis deviation, literally, because the left axis deviation is anywhere between minus 30 degrees and minus 90 degrees. And to confirm, you can also see that leads 3, AVF, and AVR are all negative, so it's pointing away from AVR, 3, and AVF, and this confirms our finding. And now let's see an example on right axis deviation. And you can notice that this ECG is the same one that we have used previously on the quadrant method. And you can see again that lead 1 is negative and AVF is positive, so that means right axis deviation. And your cardiac axis is anywhere between positive 90 degrees to positive 180 degrees. But how much exactly is your cardiac axis? We have to use the isoelectric lead method. And your isoelectric lead here is lead 2. So using the Cabrera system, we go to lead 2 and draw a perpendicular line to lead 2. So your cardiac axis is either pointing to minus 30 degrees or to positive 150 degrees. So looking again at the other leads, we can determine in which direction is your cardiac axis. So we can see that lead 1 is negative and AVL is negative. So it has to be pointing away from AVL and 1. So your cardiac axis must be at exactly a positive 150 degrees. And you can confirm that by seeing that leads 3, AVF, and AVR are positive. So your cardiac axis is towards AVF, 3, and AVR. And this is exactly the opposite of a left axis deviation finding, if you can notice. And now coming to our last slide of this video, the extreme axis deviation. And again, if you notice, this ECG is the same one used from the quadrant method that we have used previously. And using the quadrant method, we can see that lead 1 is negative and AVF is negative. And that means your cardiac axis is in the right upper quadrant from minus 90 degrees to 180 degrees in the right upper quadrant. But again, how much exactly is your cardiac axis? We have to use the isoelectric lead method. And guess where the isoelectric lead is in here? That's right, it's AVL, and you can see that the positive deflection equals the negative deflection. And going to AVL on the Cabrera system, again, we draw a perpendicular line to AVL. So that means your cardiac axis is either pointing to the minus 120 degrees or to the positive 60 degrees. And again, which direction is the correct one? We have to look at the other leads. So looking at the other leads, we can see that leads 1, 2, 3, and AVF are all negative. So logically, your cardiac axis must be going in the direction opposite to these leads. So your cardiac axis must be at minus 120 degrees. And to confirm, you can see that lead AVR is positive, so it's pointing towards lead AVR. That would be all for this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I really hope that you have been enjoying our ECG videos. Thank you again, and have a great day interpreting your ECGs.